You mentioned earlier that you were commentating. That's how I actually got to know you and observe you before this interview. How much does it really help, or does it help, your jiu-jitsu when you are a commentator? In other words, maybe you need to be a practitioner in jiu-jitsu to commentate, but how does it benefit the other way around?
That's a good question. So the reason that I started commentating was because I was injured from time to time, as often happens in jiu-jitsu. And when I was sitting out, like I didn't want to just sit out. Like I would still go to class and take notes and everything, but it just felt like sometimes I'm sitting at home watching tape or doing whatever to visualize things. So, but it felt like it was a little bit of wasted time. Like I could be doing more, right? So I started commentating because I knew how hard, like, for the first 3 or 4 years, it was really tough to like tell what the hell's happening in big tournaments, even after training that long. And then finally, at some point, it started to click. So on my downtime, I realized like I could be helping out these newer practitioners. So I started commentating to give context for newer grapplers so they'd know what they're looking at. But over the years of doing that and watching so much tape, and then later on getting hired by Flow Grappling and other independent companies to go commentate their matches in different countries and everything, you just see so much high-level jiu-jitsu, and you have to be very present when you're commentating. You have to, if you're doing play-by-play, you have to be like right on top of the action. And you don't always remember everything in the moment, but just by being around so much jiu-jitsu all the time, it forces you to look at it more analytically, see so much high-level competition. You're seeing what the best guys are doing at that moment in time, and that is just so much good information for you as like a jiu-jitsu analyst. It's so much great content to pour over in your mind. If you go back and watch replays too, like, oh man, it really helps a ton. So for me, that helped me technically as a jiu-jitsu instructor and practitioner quite a bit. So I'm just doing it for many, many years now, maybe coming up on a decade maybe. So been a long time, a lot to go over, but yeah, I've learned so much from it.
So if there were to be a percentage pie of that helped you become, like even one of, you're officially my instructor, as I mentioned that, if you were to break it out in percentage, training, teaching, and commentating, how much of that is responsible to your makeup as an instructor?
Well, training definitely is like 75%,
sure.
Right? Like that, I mean, it's the main part. It doesn't really matter as much who you train with, as much. Like if you want to be a competition level person, you have to train almost always. Like there's some exceptions. Hodge Gracie moved to the UK and he started his own thing there, and there's like a bunch of white and blue belts, right? And he that year came back and won world championship. Pretty amazing, but it's also Hodge Gracie's like the greatest of all time. So there are some exceptions, but he was also amazing as he was already Hodge Gracie, right? He was already that high, super high level before he moved out there. If you're still coming up, definitely training with high-level black belts is important, I think, to be at that competition level and to see what's out there and to know what you're going to be up against. But you don't have to do it all the time. You just need to do it sometimes, right? Like maybe a few training sessions with them per, a few matches per training session, right? Like maybe if you're going to have 6 or 10 training sessions, or 6 or 10 matches in one training session, like maybe 1 or 2 of them with world-class black belts, if you can find them, helps. But you don't have to have that every day, and you don't have to have it every training session. I think as long as you have an instructor that is really technical and can guide you properly, that's the most important out of all of it. My instructors from the past, far and away, definitely gave me the most knowledge out of any other form of, whether it be me training with other people or whatever, just learning from a really good instructor. And if you watch like Gordon Ryan, he'll say the same thing about John Danaher. Like that's the number one thing that attributed to his growth that quickly and that early in his career, right? But watching film alone is a big part of it. It's like I don't know, maybe 10%, 15%. It's quite a bit.
That big. And then
Yeah. So probably about 70% would be teaching, right? Or I'm sorry, 70% would be training, because that's where your instructor can oversee your training. That's where you build all the skills and you can put into action all the things that you've just learned, right? So for sure, training is the majority of where your skill comes from. But
and we were referring to black belt training, black belt on black belt training also.
yeah, I mean that helps, but it's
Right.
honestly like learning from someone that is very knowledgeable, like a head instructor, right? Like that's really the most important. So that really is where like the vast majority of it comes from. Then I would say watching tape helps a lot, like whether it's commentating on tape or just watching it at home, watching instructionals, anything like that. I think at a certain point, watching tape starts to cut more into that pie than normal, because you've learned so much that there's only so much that a head instructor can teach you unless you go and find a different head instructor that has totally different theories on things, and you have to relearn their system and all of that. So like the more you know, the more watching tape helps you, right? Because now you can get context, you know what they're doing, you can gain a lot from it. Just watching even just jiu-jitsu matches or commentating on matches or watching instructionals or anything like that, right? So you can get a lot more from that. But then teaching also helps you learn a lot about jiu-jitsu too, because it forces you to think about things that you didn't think about before, right? So if you have to explain something and maybe you're good at doing it, but you've never had to show somebody that is not physically capable like you are how to do it, you have to deconstruct all of that in your mind to be able to explain it to them, or at least you should do that if you want to be a good instructor, right? Instead of just saying, just do it, and when I do it, it works, so I don't know what's wrong with you, right? If you actually like help them break it down, that for me has been a huge learning tool. So I'd say like probably 20% of the pie is teaching, maybe about 10 to 15% is video, commentating, just watching a lot of footage, and 70% is learning from your instructor and training, right? Training with, whether that be with black belts or whoever, right? But as you train longer and longer, the teaching and the video actually starts to become a bigger part of the pie, like maybe closer to like a 40% overall for the two, or 50% overall for the two. So that's kind of interesting, the way I never really thought about it so much in that way, but it does change as you learn a lot more, because there's just less overall to learn from your training experiences and from one head instructor. Right?
It's like switching attributes.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. So, and especially like there's so many people coming up that are starting with, I mean, like blue belts. When I started, were terrible compared to blue belts, like your average blue belt now. Like, oh my God, night and day difference. And kids that are getting their like purple belt at 17 or whatever, but they've been training for 10 years already since they were kids, and they just couldn't get a higher belt than, they could never even get their blue belt till they're 15 or whatever age it is, 15 or 16. Those kids are becoming, they'll get their blue belt and they'll be the world champion at blue belt. They'll get their purple belt the next year, become world champion at purple belt, and so on until they're a black belt world champion in like 4 years. So, but if you looked at it, it's like, wow, you just got your black belt and you're world champion? Well, they've been training 15 years. So it makes more sense. But in the past, that was not even like a thing. Blue belts were just kind of garbage, and purple belts were like, had real skills, but they would never touch like a brown belt or a black belt for the most part. And then since I've been training, like, oh man, a world class, like a Pan Am champ blue belt will like blow a casual black belt like out of the water half the time, right? So
Right.
It's just like a completely different landscape of jiu-jitsu. And a lot of it's just because the technical knowledge has gone through the roof. So a lot better spread of information. It's much more accessible, and people have really dedicated themselves to the art. So it's really great to see the progression. I'm all for it, even though some of the older guys like myself, we start to feel it a little bit more on the physical side of things. But it's overall great for the sport.
All right, John. Thank you so much, bro.
Oh man,
Appreciate
always
you,
a
bro.
pleasure, Charles.
Cool.
Appreciate it.
Chat.